and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. So how much time do you set aside during your sewing project for fitting and making adjustments? An hour? Half a day? None at all? Today's episode with pattern cutter and fitting expert Kate Roberts tells us why we can't expect sewing patterns to fit right out of the pack. And Kate shares her tried and true method for assessing the fit of a garment that you can start using today. So stay tuned for all of that and much more. But first, I want to say hello. How are you doing? What's new with you? Something that's new with me that I'd like to tell you about is that I'm going to be teaching a sewing class soon. I'll be teaching how to make Birgitta Helmersson's zero waist cropped shirt pattern in a class on the 16th of September. It's happening at Fabric Godmother here in Portslade, which is just outside of Brighton in the UK. If you are interested in zero waist sewing patterns, but you feel a little bit unsure of how to begin and you'd like the support of a class, please check out the listing in the show notes. I'm super excited to be getting back into teaching and I adore this pattern. We'll be covering how to make alterations for a custom fit, how to mark and cut your fabric, how you can hack it to make different sleeve shapes. So yeah, link is in the show notes for that. Are you making anything at the moment? I've been making a dress and some undies for my daughter out of some remnants and leftovers of Slinky jersey. So that section of my stash is looking a bit more manageable now. Plus, I just completely veered away from my summer sewing plans and I've cut myself out a top from some thrifted vintage cotton. Usually, I'm very good at ploughing through the projects that I know my family needs the most, but occasionally I just decide to follow a whim, and that's what's happening here. After much umming and ahhing and Instagram polling, I've settled on the Fibre Mood dolly dress pattern that I'm cropping into a blouse length. And I always forget that Fibre Mood patterns need their seam allowances added though. It nearly tripped me up, but thankfully I remembered before it was too late. So this week's sustainability wins. Well, it's not a complete win because it usually never is. But this weekend, both my kids are going on their first scout camp type thing. And because life has been so manic lately, and because I'm me, I kind of left it to the last minute to work out what they need to take. So we are not an outdoorsy family at all. Plus, we've always lived in pretty small homes with very little storage. So we just don't own camping stuff. That said, despite leaving it to the 11th hour, we've managed to collate everything that they need whilst only buying a couple of new items. We've had to buy one sleeping mat and 2 torches new, but everything else we were able to repurpose or get hold of secondhand. So that's my win. So massive thanks this week to Kathy and Annabelle for kindly signing up to support Check Your Thread via Patreon. Much appreciated. I recently did a bit of a time trial on myself and worked out that I spend around 15 to 20 hours each week working on this podcast, excluding the time that I spend on social media. If you'd like to help me stay caffeinated and pay some bills whilst I make Check Your Thread, please check out the link in the show notes or on the website to find out how you can sign up also. You can do so for any amount at all and it all really, really helps. Also, don't forget to sign up to the recently relaunched weekly Check Your Thread newsletter if you haven't already. And if you have already, but haven't seen it over these last few weeks, check your promotions folder or your junk folder and mark it as safe. Okay, so back to the main episode topic. This is the first of 2 episodes I'm releasing with Kate from Project Patterns. You'll hear pretty quickly why I think that garment fitting is such an important topic for those of us who want to create clothes more sustainably. There is so much in both these episodes. For example, in this one, Kate gives some awesome tips for successful solo fit sessions, which I am definitely going to be implementing. So have a great week, take care of yourself, sign up to the newsletter if you haven't already, and enjoy! Hello, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is so exciting.
This is super exciting. So I first knew of you during lockdown. You were incredibly helpful to me when I was having some trouble with some trousers, and I was like, this woman's amazing. So I'm so excited that I get to chat with you properly, not just in a DM, and a bit more thoroughly. So thank you so much for giving me some of your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I was like having a little read through our messages before we started chatting. I was literally like, this was ages ago that we started talking. It's nice to actually chat in person.
I know. So can you please do the normal Check Your Thread kind of intro? Would you please tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
Okay, so I'm Kate, or Catherine. I use both. I'm a professional pattern cutter. I work in London, and as well as working in the industry, I also have a teaching business called Project Patterns. So I do online courses, YouTube tutorials, one-to-one lessons, all that kind of stuff. And basically just wanted to share my love of pattern cutting with everyone else. And that's me in a nutshell, really.
I would love to hear a little bit more about that before we crack on with kind of more getting into the nitty gritty. So you were a pattern cutter like for a specific designer or like some sort of design company or?
Yeah, so I'm freelance.
So have you always been freelance as that since?
Not always. So since 2017, I've been freelance. I started working as a pattern cutter in 2015 or 14, somewhere around there. Worked for amazing brands, Karen Millen, Peter Pilotto, as a full-time employee. And then I took the step to go freelance, just have a bit more control over my life. Fashion can be quite hectic sometimes.
Yeah, it's very all-consuming, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So I went freelance just to find a bit more of a work-life balance and have never looked back. I love being freelance. And now I work 3 days a week as a freelance pattern cutter for mainly one brand. I've had to slim it down because I want to concentrate on my teaching business.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple of smaller brands that I squeeze in here and there for bespoke stuff.
Awesome. So tell me more about Project Patterns. Like, what inspired you to start it up? What does it entail? It seems to entail lots of things. You seem super busy.
Yeah, it does. So it started really organically. I'm good friends with Hannah from the New Craft House, and we met because we both lived on boats in a really weird way, like our worlds just collided. So I started doing a couple of in-person classes for her, just teaching block drafting and things like that. And then I thought, oh, this is really fun. I'm really enjoying this. Maybe I'll start an Instagram page just to share some of my process and some of my thoughts and some little like tips and tricks for people. And from there, it kind of grew, and then lockdown happened probably about a year after I started my Instagram page. And unfortunately, because I'm freelance, I lost all my work. So I was like, yeah, maybe I'll just really put all my energy into this teaching stuff and see if I can make this work. And thankfully, people were at home and wanted to learn how to use patterns and make their own patterns. So I started doing live Zoom classes, just really short ones, teaching little things, and then started gradually doing more online courses. So courses that are self-led, that anyone in any time zone can do whenever they want, and they can replay and rewind and all of that. And it's just slowly evolved really organically from there. So now I have, I think, 6 or 7 online courses that people can take. I still do live courses as well.
Yeah.
I do live versions of my self-led courses so people can ask questions and get live feedback. And I do one-to-one lessons as well. And then I also do little YouTube lives and stuff. I do a monthly series called Drafting Diaries with Charlotta from Charlotta's School of Pattern Cutting, where we deep dive into loads of stuff as well.
Amazing. You've got quite a lot of cool content on YouTube as well to watch anytime as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I do. I try to do things across multiple platforms because I know people like different formats and stuff.
Yeah.
Instagram is where I'm most active, I would say. But YouTube, I enjoy putting stuff on there as well because you can put longer format and more detailed stuff.
Sure, and it doesn't get lost. It's kind of there. Wow, you seem so busy. That's awesome. So I just want to give a little bit of context of why we're speaking today and why I'm so excited to be addressing this topic. So I am always banging on about like the overarching goal of sewing more sustainably as I see it, which is to attempt to make garments that we really love that will see a lot of wear over years. I think that's the best we can hope for really in terms of kind of creating more sustainably. And I feel like how we can do that is by making clothes or attempting to make clothes that fit our personal style, fit our lifestyle, and fitting our bodies as best we can. So I'm hoping that we can really get into that third bit today, because I feel like for home sewers rather than trained pattern cutters, that is probably the most mysterious and maybe the most daunting bit. Like, what do you think?
I would agree. It feels like the skill that people learn last, if that makes sense. So people learn to sew, they get their basic sewing skills, they learn what a pattern is, how it works, and sometimes people will learn how to draft their own patterns, but then the fitting is like the last part, right? Because it's kind of the last part of the process as well. So I think by the time people get to the fitting part, they're just exhausted and overwhelmed. So then it doesn't get as much attention, and it's so difficult to learn because it's not like A plus B equals C situation. It's much more organic and much more tricky.
It's so personal, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it is something that is a little mysterious for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. It can be really fun, and it can be something that you use within your process, not just at the end of it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm hoping that we can kind of scratch away at a little bit today, to give people a few more ideas and resources and confidence, really, to have a go, I think, as well. So what you just touched on then was something I wanted to ask you. Do you feel like that altering garments and patterns to fit you is like a necessary evil, or do you think it can be like a fun challenge in and of itself? Like, how do you view it?
I think it's a fun challenge. And I guess it depends how you like to learn and how you're hardwired. But I think it's a really fun challenge because every single garment is a new learning experience and a new chance to push your skills. And it's something that once you get your head around pattern cutting and how patterns relate to the body, it's like another layer to add to your thinking as you're drafting and sewing. So for me, I think it's really fun and it's a great challenge. And, you know, I've been doing this for a long time and I still learn every single time I fit to a new body type or a new person as well.
It's an angle for self-knowledge as well, isn't it? About learning about yourself and your body as well.
Yeah, for sure. And our bodies are constantly changing as well.
So true.
It's always a new challenge when you haven't stitched something for a little while and you think, oh, well, it's been a few years, my body has changed, or, maybe you've had a baby, or, maybe you've started going to gym, so your body has changed that way. It's always a new challenge and it's always really exciting to learn new things about yourself.
So, like, when did you discover, like, pattern cutting? Like, when did you decide, I'm in, this is for me?
Okay, so maybe go back a bit further. So sewing has always been a part of my life, right? So my mum has always sewed and had sewing businesses. So growing up as a child, I watched my mum essentially provide for our family with her sewing machine. So it's always been a huge part of my life, but I never really thought about doing it as a career until I went to university and I studied fashion design, which wasn't the original plan. I was supposed to do medicine and pivoted very late.
Oh, did you?
But I'm very happy that I did. But I obviously wanted to be a fashion designer like everyone does. And then I realized design is maybe not my thing, but the technical stuff I loved and had a natural flair for. So my pattern cutting tutor was like, hey, why don't you think about doing this as a career? And then from there, I never really looked back. I graduated, went straight into the industry, got a graduate position at Karen Millen, which was amazing. I learned so much. And then from there, I got my first junior pattern cutter job at Peter Pilotto. And then, the rest is history.
So what does that entail? So are you like getting sketches from designers and then you create the pattern and then somebody else sews it? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, so the process is exactly like you just said. So the designer will come to me with a sketch. Sometimes it's just a series of inspiration images and they're like, hey, this is
with that basic.
This is the vibe I'm going for. Like, see what you can come up with and let's like collaborate a little bit.
Oh, so it's very creative as well. It's not like I want exactly this.
Yeah, every designer works differently. So sometimes they do come with a very detailed sketch and it's like proportioned to the millimeter, and then you do just give them exactly what they want. But often it's much more creative than that, and it's a little bit of a collaboration. And sometimes the design doesn't quite work technically, so I'll be like, oh well, why don't we try this instead? It's still along the same lines, but this might work for the factories a little bit better, or it might work with our fit a little bit better. So we'll have that discussion. I'll make the pattern and then I'll give that pattern to someone else to actually cut out the fabric. And then they give that fabric to a machinist, a sewer, who will stitch up the garment. And then it comes back to me and then I fit it. And in the fitting will be like the designer, me, a garment tech. And we'll look at things like how it fits the body, of course, like how it actually functions. And then we'll look at the design as well. So we'll think, do the proportions work? Do we like that kind of collar? Would it be better with the placket? Those kinds of things. And then I'll amend the pattern, and then we'll repeat the process.
Wow. You must have just learnt so much through that fitting process of seeing it on bodies. It was fitting something that you touched on at university, or was it all the stuff that came to you through like actually doing it?
Yeah, we touched on it a bit at university, but less in a functional way, if that makes sense. So at university, it was all about design. So it's all about trying to achieve the design that we wanted. So of course, within that, like you have to fit it on models and mannequins. So you learn a little bit about the basics of fitting. But really, the place that I learned fitting was in the fit sessions as a pattern cutter. And as a junior pattern cutter, you often go into the fit sessions and you don't have a role within the fit session. You're just there to observe. And that's something that I got to do a lot at Karen Millen, which they were hugely supportive. And then when I went as a junior pattern cutter, I started getting a little bit more involved. My senior pattern cutter would kind of take me and say, well, look, we have this problem. Let's pin it like this. And then after the fit session, I'll show you how we amend the pattern. And you slowly learn by doing that. And you often will see like similar problems. And it's just a skill that you have to develop through doing, unfortunately.
Yeah. So is that what you would recommend for people at home? Like there's not really a kind of fast track way as such, or are there some resources you can point them to? Or is it literally just like you just need to go through that process at home or with a sewing buddy if you can and try and figure it out?
It is unfortunately a process that you have to learn. And I really wish there was some kind of magic formula I could give people and be like, this is what you need to do to get there. But it is just trial and error sometimes. There are so many amazing resources though that can help you through that trial and error. There's amazing videos on YouTube for fitting, often like not specific problems, more about like the process and like general problems. There are online courses that you can take and there are books that you can get as well. What I would say about the books is that you should try and get one with photographs rather than illustrations. But my advice for people would be to start simple. Don't pick a trouser as your first garment that you're going to try and learn to fit. It's the most complicated, so it's going to be really, really hard. Pick something simple like a skirt or a simple blouse, and then gradually start doing more complex garments. It's like when you're learning sewing. You learn to sew simple stuff and you work your way up.
So a lot of home sewers, I'm massively generalising here, obviously, but it's something that I have witnessed when I've taught sewing classes, that a lot of home sewers feel like once they've got the right size, that when they make a garment and it doesn't fit them perfectly straight out the packet, that they think that there's some sort of fault with their body, you know? Is that like a kind of feeling or a vibe that you've experienced through the sewing community at all? Like, is that just something that I've noticed?
No, that's definitely something that I've noticed as well. It's something that whenever I have live fitting classes, I always start at the beginning and I'm like, the problem is never your body. The problem is the pattern. Your body is perfect, it's unique, and it's differently proportioned to everyone else's. No two bodies are the same, and that's great. That's actually something that we should celebrate, that we're all different, because why would we all want to be the same, right? But it's just like when you walk into a shop and the clothes don't fit you properly. Buying a commercial pattern is the same process, because developing a commercial pattern is the same process as developing a commercial garment. So it's done to a block or a standard. That's like an average standard or an average block. Not everybody is average. And the great thing about pattern cutting is that we can change that pattern so that it perfectly fits and represents your body. And that's something that I love about teaching, that little like light bulb moment when someone is like, wow, it fits. And I did it. And I love it.
Oh,
that is like the ultimate moment in teaching for me.
And that's often, I think, why people get into sewing and making their own clothes in the first place, isn't it? Because they're so sick of garments not really, from the shops, not really fitting them. Even people that have got the same measurements as each other, they're not going to be the same shape. But those garments are not going to sit on them in the same way, are they? Because we're proportioned differently, and now fullness is distributed differently as well, isn't it?
And our posture is different as well. You know, someone who has a very physical job, someone who does manual labor, is going to have very different posture to someone who sits at a desk all day. Even if they are exactly the same measurements, they're going to have different posture. And the way we stand really impacts on how our garments fit us.
That's a really good point. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of quite specific questions now that I've been really looking forward to asking you. So what are your thoughts on tissue fitting? Because some of the books that are for fitting, like, for example, the Palmer Pletch books, they're encouraging us to, if you've got a paper pattern that's made of tissue paper, that you actually fit the tissue. Do you think that there is a time and place when that is useful, or do you think we should always be making a toile or a muslin?
There's a time and place for tissue fitting for sure.
Okay.
And in the industry, what most pattern cutters will do is they'll make their paper pattern and then they'll pin it together and they'll put it on the stand or the mannequin.
Right.
And what we're doing there is we're seeing if there's any obvious things that are completely wrong. So if our side seam is swinging forwards or backwards, if your darts are in completely the wrong place for the bust or something like that. And the idea of tissue fitting on a body is exactly the same process, right? You're taking your pattern, you're putting it on the body, you're checking the big things to see if anything is completely wrong. Circumference, dart position, those kinds of things. So there is definitely a time and place for tissue fitting. It does need to be a woven non-stretch fabric that you're intending to make your garment in, because you can't obviously take like a stretch pattern and then put a paper on you and expect it to fit. It's never going to work. And things like bias and those kinds of things. But I do, if you're using a woven non-stretch fabric, then for sure tissue fitting is a really great first step. You do still need to make a toile in muslin or calico though.
Right. So where are its limitations? Like, at what point then do we need to move into fabric?
So it has limitations in that generally you'll only have half of the pattern if it's symmetrical, right? And it's really difficult on your body to pinpoint exactly where your centre front and centre back are, particularly if you're fitting on yourself. How can you pin your centre back on your clothes? It's really, really difficult if you don't have a friend to help you. So that is a huge limitation in that you might be checking your circumference measurements, but they're not accurate because you're working on a half. Also, paper doesn't quite move in the same way that fabric does, so it doesn't drop in the same way. If you have a kind of more loose fitting garment, your arm is going to put the paper down against your body and it's going to bulge out, whereas in a fabric that might drop and create a nice fluted pattern. So it's really only good for that first initial step of checking those big things to see if there's any huge like red flags in that garment. So it's almost like an extra process for me that you can do before you make your toile or your muslin.
Right. So how often should we be making toiles or muslin? Should we be doing it every time we've used a pattern that we haven't touched before?
Yeah.
Tell it to me straight.
Yeah, 100%. Always make a toile or a muslin. And I know it can be a long process and it's really tempting to skip the stage. I'm really guilty of skipping it myself, but I always wish I'd done it, basically. Even if it's like little things, you want to get it right. And going back to that point about sustainability that you were making at the beginning, the best thing we can do is make garments that we wear over and over again for long periods of time. And the best way to do that is to get a garment that you feel $1 million in. And if you feel great, chances are it fits great, right? And if you want to get your fit 100%, you've got to make a toile.
Okay. So I have heard arguments when you're making a garment from woven fabric that to make a toile or muslin, you should be always using calico or muslin. But then I've also heard arguments that you should be making a toile or muslin in a fabric that as closely reflects the properties of your final fabric as possible. So I must admit that as a sewing teacher, I've often erred on the second side, but is that wrong? What would you say? Where do you fall down on that debate?
I think it depends on the garment, and I think it depends how confident you are on the pattern.
Okay.
So if it's something that you've drafted from scratch, that you are like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I've done it right, but I just really need to check this because it's not that someone else has drafted this. I've done it myself, and it's maybe a new type of garment, and maybe I'm pushing my skills a little bit. Then always calico first, or something like a muslin or something like that.
Why is that?
Because if it's something you've drafted from scratch, you're probably going to change the design as well. Once you get it made up, you're going to then think proportions, necklines, armholes, those kinds of things. You might want to put a collar on it. If it's something you've drafted yourself, you're still really designing it.
Right. So we're still talking about basic shapes, really, rather than nitty-gritty details. Yeah.
Yeah, or even nitty-gritty details as well. For me, that first fitting is part of the design process. So you're probably going to change it. If it's something, and, once you've done your calico toile, then you're probably going to want to do one more toile in a fabric that is very similar to your final fabric.
Oh, so you do both?
Yes. If it's something you've drafted yourself and it's something that is new to you. Because that first toile is going to essentially be a wasted garment. The second toile, you can probably get away with making it a wearable toile. So then you do it in a slightly nicer fabric. And you want it, of course, to be as close as possible to your final garment. But if it's something that you have made before or something that you're really confident with and you're like, yeah, I've made a ton of gathered dresses with a shawl collar or something, then by all means skip the calico stage, go straight into a fabric that is similar to your final fabric. For me, it's all about confidence, and if you're going to change the design or if you think you are a bit unsure about your drafting process or the fitting or something like that.
That's really interesting and not what I was expecting you to say, so thank you. I'm not sure what I was expecting you to say, but I don't think it was both.
It's so project dependent, like in the industry, if we have a thing called a carryover, which is if we take a garment that we have developed for a previous season and we rework it slightly for the new season. For something like that, we're pretty confident in the pattern. It's just got small changes. So we'll toile it in a fabric very similar to our final fabric. If it's something that I've done completely from scratch, maybe it's like, a new ball gown or something that I've draped and it's really creative. And I'm like, yeah, this is really the beginning of the development process. We're making it in calico first, for sure.
Okay, awesome. Do you toile knit garments?
Yes, I do.
What's the calico equivalent?
I don't have one. I'm still looking. Something cheap with the same amount of stretch, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's similar weight, similar stretch.
Yeah. As close as possible as you can get to your final fabric without blowing the budget, basically.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because there's so many kind of variables with knit, isn't there, really?
Yeah, it's always so difficult. If I'm making a knit garment for myself, then I will get enough fabric to make 2 of them, just in case.
Ah, okay. That's cool. That's a top tip. Cool. Okay, so obviously when you're making fit adjustments kind of professionally, as you were saying, that you're using a fit model or possibly a mannequin. But for us home sewers, often we're doing this solo on our own bodies in a poorly lit bedroom. So do you have any tips on how we can approach fitting on ourselves?
For sure.
And what equipment do we need as well?
Well, very basic equipment. And I definitely feel everyone's pain here because as well as working in the industry, I obviously make my own clothes. So like fitting on myself is always really, really tricky. So I feel people's pain here. But equipment wise, super simple. What I do is I take my phone and I put it on a bookshelf and I take videos of myself. I have a little self timer and I take videos. So I will have my back to my camera, making sure that I am standing in a natural position. I'm not arching weirdly or twisting or doing anything like that. I'm just like naturally standing there, back towards the camera. And then I can see exactly what my garment looks like from the back. I might do a few slow spins. I might move a little bit, do things like that. So I've got it all on camera. And then I can actually just go and look through that footage and it's as if I'm seeing it on someone else. And that is so helpful because if you're in the mirror and you're twisting, you're changing your posture, which is changing your garment, right?
So you're literally using yourself as a fit model, like you're looking at yourself as if you're looking at somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really helpful because then you get to see your garment as it's seen by everyone else. Of course, pinning is then a little bit more difficult, but you can get an idea of what needs to be done from there. Maybe your centre back is too long on your bodice or your dress and you want to reduce it out. So you can have a look at your footage and be like, oh, okay, well, it looks about 2 centimeters too long. I take my garment off and then I pin that 2 centimeters out and then I put it back on and I repeat the process. I take a video and I say, oh, okay, has it improved? Do I need to take more or do I need to take less? And then I just repeat that process over and over again until I'm happy with what I've got.
So you need like a good amount of time as well, and you need to not be doing it when you're tired, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And it's when you're tired, it's so easy to get fed up, right? And just be like, no, I'm done. I'm not coming back to this.
Yeah.
But,
Bin it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Going in the pile of half-made things.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, that's super useful. So when we've made the toile or muslin, we've taken the video, what are you looking for? Like, how do you ascertain what might need to be altered? Is there like a process or like a mental flow chart or something? Like,
sure. So every single garment that I fit, I look at 3 kind of categories, right? So first is circumference measurements. So is your bust, waist and hip correct? Is it too big, too small? Are things like your cross front and your shoulder width, are those too big or too small? Then I look at things like lengths. So is it the right length overall? Is it the right length in each area? So our bodice length, for example, is it the right length? Is our waist sitting in our natural waist, or is it too high or too low? And within lengths, I also look at balance. Is our garment swinging backwards or forwards? Is it collapsing? Is it poking out? How is the balance of the garment? And for anyone who doesn't know what balance is really just how your garment hangs on the body. Every garment has a specific way it should hang. And then after I've got my circumference and my balance assessed, then I look at my shaping. And that's things like darts, position of your darts, the widths of your darts. That's things like seams, if you've got shaping in your seams. That's things like the shape of your trouser rise, all those kinds of things. Your neckline shapes. Is your neckline gaping? Is your armhole gaping? Those kinds of things. And I assess those 3 areas. And then based on that overall assessment, I then start to think, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to amend this? I have these 5 problems. How do I fix them?
Do you like physically write them down? Like how, or do you just keep it in your head?
No, I write everything down. I'm that person. I have like endless lists. So many lists. Yeah.
I think that's such a good idea, because when you're looking at it, until you get back downstairs and you've changed out of it, you could forget easily, couldn't you?
Yeah, for sure. And I think for me, it comes from my personal training, because in every fit session, we write a list of everything that needs to be done, because I might fit 20 garments in one fit session. And then it's really difficult to remember everything that needs to be done. So
yeah, what were we doing with that jacket?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so even when I fit on myself, I write everything down. And in all my classes that I do as well, I write everything down for my students, because you might also want to refer back to what you did at some point. You might fit something that's kind of similar and think, hey, I know I did some adjustments on that top that was really similar. What was that? And then you can go back and you can look at that. I think documenting the whole process, and that's, photographs, writing stuff down, taking photographs of your patterns and your adjustments, that's really helpful. And that's a great learning experience as well.
That makes so much sense, because that's kind of come back to what we were saying before. Like, there isn't really any fast track. You've just got to get cracking. But to do it in that real conscious kind of methodical way, you're going to get more from the process, aren't you? It's going to be a more valuable process to go through.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also nice to look back, if you've really been concentrating on trying to grow your fitting skills for, say, a year, you can look back on your notes from the beginning of the year, look at the photographs, and you might spot things that you didn't spot at the beginning, and you can see how your skills have grown and developed. And that's so rewarding as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so say you have just fitted a garment and you figure out that, or you videoed yourself in the garment and you figured out you've probably got about 5 changes to make. So would you approach making the changes to the pattern in that order too? Or is it possible that some of those alterations may almost like affect another or cancel another out in some way, or negate needing to do another? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely something to think about. So obviously I look at those 3 areas, but I don't actually decide what I'm going to do until after I've assessed all 3 areas, because sometimes one adjustment will affect something else. So if my neckline is gaping, I put in a temporary dart and I rotate that into an existing dart. But also if I then have a problem with that dart, those 2 adjustments that I'm going to need to do are going to be interlinked. So they'll have some sort of effect on each other. Yeah. And things like trousers are a great example of this, because sometimes your rise shape can affect how it fits the body, but also your rise width might affect and your rise height. So sometimes when you reduce your rise height, you're fixing the shaping of your problem down your leg, you also then need to scoop out the rise, which then is changing the curve of the rise. So they all sort of have little knock-on effects for adjustments.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can do one adjustment in a certain way that will fix two problems.
Right, okay. That sounds kind of like I was like having some horrible flashbacks then of some trouser nightmares that I'd kind of gone down a couple of years ago. So let's take the trousers as an example, because I think that is the most daunting. Like how do you decide what to do first with like a trouser?
I would say fix the big things first, right? So there are certain adjustments that are really big adjustments and will have a huge effect. So things like a full seat adjustment, things like that. Things like your trouser width as well is a really, really big one. So fix the big things first and then fine tune it after that. So you know, make your adjustments on your toile and then fine tune it from there and make a second toile or a third toile.
I was going to say, at what point do you make a new toile? I guess you can do a certain amount of fitting and whatever with the original one, but at some point you're going to want to then check that with like a fresh bit of fabric, aren't you?
For sure. My biggest advice for trousers specifically, but this also applies for all garments, is to test your adjustment on your toile. So that's pinning volume out, that's cutting and pinning fabric in if it's too tight, that's redrawing your rise seam, that's drawing on your bust dart positions, unpicking your darts, pinning them to the width that they actually need to be, doing all those big adjustments. You can test them on your toile, get them as accurate as possible, and then adjust your pattern and then make a new toile to check that you've done the right thing.
I think that's a good thing about calico, isn't it? You can literally draw on it with pen or pencil, can't you? And have that information really visible.
Yeah, and toiles are meant to be toiles. They're not meant to be garments that you wear again. So don't be afraid to cut into them or draw on them or do anything. They're literally there as part of the development. You don't need to be precious with them. Okay,
so obviously you are kind of firmly team fit, as am I. I think that often people, when they're thinking about their sewing projects, they're not maybe allocating as much time and energy to the fit part of the process as maybe they should. Do you feel like that? I feel a lot of people are like, I'm going to do the cutting one day and I'm going to sew the other day and I'm done. It's like, well, where does fitting fit into that? Do you think we should be kind of making that a bigger part of the whole project?
Yeah, definitely. I would always set aside a couple of hours for fitting and adjusting my pattern. And the adjusting your pattern takes a lot longer than people initially think as well, because you have to, adjust your pattern and then you want to double check it to make sure that everything still fits together, because it's a giant puzzle. All needs to fit together.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that's another thing as well that people need to remember, is that if you do something, for example, on the front, if you've lengthened something on the front, you have to then, that's not necessarily going to then match up on the side seam to the back piece and things like that, isn't there?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. Everything affects everything. So for me, if I'm making a garment for myself, I'll probably set aside like half a day for the fitting and the adjusting and all of that. And, that obviously is lots of cups of tea in the middle and lots of breaks and like faffing about, but set aside more time than you actually think you're going to need, just so that you're relaxed while you're doing it and you're not stressed. Like you said, as soon as, you get tired or something, then it feels like the end of the world when it doesn't go quite to plan. So set aside extra time for fitting and adjusting for sure.
Brilliant. You've made some changes to your toile or muslin and it's looking better. So making those changes back onto your pattern, do you just get involved? Do you trace the pattern first? Like, what's best case scenario? What would you recommend?
Okay, people are going to hate this answer, but trace a new copy of your pattern. And again, going back to that really methodical approach of pattern cutting and fitting, it's really nice to have, this is the pattern from toile number 1, this is the pattern from toile number 2, and this is my final pattern. So you can compare them. If you just take your pattern and cut straight into it and do lots of things to it, you're never going to be able to compare your original pattern with your new pattern. And that is a really good learning experience to actually take the pattern that didn't fit, the pattern that does fit, and put them on top of each other to see.
That's so interesting, isn't it, to then see what you've done. Also, like, I think you should be really proud of yourself at that point. Like, look, all these changes I've made to make it better for me.
Yeah, exactly. And that is such a rewarding experience as well, to be like, this is what I started with, this is what I had in the middle, and this is what I finished with. It's such a lovely feeling. And then you have that whole almost life cycle of your development in one place.
Yeah. And if you kind of maybe went too far, you can then go back a step as well.
Exactly. It's the equivalent of pressing Control Z on your computer. You'd be like, yeah, that did not work at all. I don't know what I did, but it didn't work. I'm going back to plan A. So it's nice to have that option. And even if you don't trace out a copy of your pattern and add seam allowance to it and everything, even if you just trace a net copy and just have all your pieces on one giant piece of paper, at least you've got a record of that original pattern.
That's such a good point. And labelling, I'm terrible for not labelling them. So I'm like, oh, which was the number 1, which is number 2, and which is number 3? Like, you just, I've got some sleeves, I don't know which one they belong to.
If it makes you feel better, I'm really bad at it as well. I have like cork pin boards on my wall, and I'm really bad at getting halfway through a pattern and then just pinning the whole pattern on my board and being like, right, I'll come back to this tomorrow. And then 3 weeks later, I'm like, which pattern was I working on?
Okay, that doesn't make me feel better, but
we all have bad habits, don't worry.
From our mistakes. So when you recommend tracing patterns, like what kind of pattern paper or what paper should people be using it? Do you have to get like professional pattern paper? If so, where from?
No, you don't have to. In an ideal world, we would all be using pattern cutting paper, which is called dot and cross paper. It has little dots and crosses all at nice 90-degree angles, and it's about 50 or 60 GSM. So it's slightly opaque, so it makes it really easy for tracing through, and it's white, which makes it easy to see stuff through as well, and means you can have a nice light background for your pencil. But of course, not everyone has access to it, and it is an extra cost. So if you are using different paper, that's fine as well. I'm a firm believer that you don't have to have the exact perfect tools to make something happen. But if you do want to get pattern cutting paper, in the UK, William G is where I get all mine, and most people will get it from there as well.
Do you get like a large roll?
I do, yeah.
A pinch, when I was living in Spain and I didn't know where you'd get things like that, I was using like the back of wrapping paper, like really wide wrapping paper.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that. I was traveling in Latin America for 4 months last year, and I was teaching while I was traveling, and I took some paper with me, but it got super crushed in my suitcase and it was just not really ideal. So I went to an art shop in every country that I got to, and I bought like A0 sheets of 60 GSM white paper, and they work perfectly.
Amazing. So where were you teaching in Latin America?
I spent 4 months traveling. I was in Peru, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, and El Salvador. So I was still teaching one-to-one lessons online. I didn't do any group sessions because sometimes the internet was a little hit and miss. If you've just got one student, it's easier to get around, or if the internet cuts out because electricity is gone or something, you can reorganize one student much easier than a group class. But it was great. I loved it.
Oh, that's amazing. So where were you doing that? Like hotel rooms? Like, what did you find a local school, or what space were you in?
Co-working spaces. So I didn't do it independently. I joined a program which was all work remote and travel. So I had a lot of support from other people, which was really great. And I was in fantastic co-working spaces with actually really amazing internet the whole time. There was only once that I had to rearrange a lesson because the internet had gone completely. But co-working spaces when you're traveling are fantastic.
That's amazing. Would you do it again?
I would, in a heartbeat. Yeah. I just spent a month in South Africa, and I was teaching remotely while I was there as well. Yeah.
Wow. Do you find it hard to kind of, traveling and experiencing new cultures and new foods, and you're in a different space, and then work mode? Do you find it difficult to like switch on to like, right, okay, I'm on?
It took a bit of adjusting. I'm not going to lie. It did take some adjusting. The first couple of weeks were... It was difficult to not be like, I'm on holiday. But I set some pretty strong boundaries of like Monday to Friday, 8 till before I am working. I am as if I'm in London. I am working my normal hours. So I'm in the co-working space doing what I need to do. And any lunchtime or the morning or evening, that's my time to explore. So it took a lot of adjusting, but I got there in the end, and it all clicked into place really nicely. And because I was with a group of people who were also all working remotely and traveling, we all still were together most of the time in the co-working spaces. So you have that support and encouragement as well.
Yeah, I love that. I haven't even heard of that, but that makes so much sense, because most of the time when people like go traveling, they have to save a bunch of money, which is really tough to do, and like put everything on hold for 6 months or so. But with that, you can keep generating income. You can keep yourself afloat whilst having this amazing experience. That's so cool.
Yeah, it was incredible. I've always wanted to travel, and, I spent a lot of time building up project patterns, and I was still freelancing as well, working remotely because I do digital pattern cutting. And I didn't want to let down any of my clients or any of my students, and I didn't want to put aside the business I've worked hard to grow and then come back and have to start again from scratch. So working remotely and traveling was a great way to still have all of that and still experience new things. And of course, there were things that I missed out on that I was like, oh, I really want to do this, but I can't because I need to work. But I still saw more than I would have if I wasn't there. So it was great.
But also, I think that's so cool you have the experience of what it's like to work in another country as well. Like what it's like to commute, what it's like to go and get your lunch, what it's like to... That's something that people that are literally just travelling, then they don't get to feel what it's like to live somewhere.
Yeah, it felt like having real-ish life in another city.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!